Hey there, this is Jewane Newman with FlyGirlSchool. FlyGirlSchool is where we provide tips, guidance, and coaching to flight attendant hopefuls. For those of you that are new to being a flight attendant and need to learn to navigate this new career, that includes overnight tips, packing, and then also the best part of being a flight attendant, how to non-rev. Today we're going to talk about what is reserve life. Reserve is an on-duty call where you are called out to start your trip. Mostly all airlines have all flight attendants start on reserve once they finish training. Almost every airline, every flight attendant starts off reserve, no matter where you're based. Now, how long you stay on reserve depends on your airline and your base. So a couple things that we're going to talk about today is what is reserve, how long you're typically on reserve, what is your pay while you're on reserve, the pros and cons of being on reserve. I've been with my airline for 5 years. I just hit my 5-year anniversary, and usually with my particular airline, you're not on reserve this long. Earlier this year, I broke my finger, and so I was off of work for about 3.5 months. And when I was released to return to work, I was released to return to work outside of the parameters or the deadlines to bid. So since I couldn't bid for my schedule, now I'm placed on reserve. Now, I was on reserve, again, 5 years ago when I first started with my airline, and I wasn't living in base at the time. Today I live in base, so being on reserve is actually not that bad when you're living in base, because I get to stay at home and do whatever it is, the things that I normally do while I'm waiting to be called out. So number one, let's talk about what is reserve. So reserve is, again, being on an on-call schedule. We've heard of nurses and doctors being on call. It's the same type of deal. So your company calls you and gives you typically a 2-hour call out time to get to the airport. Some airlines, and depending on your cities, some airlines provide a 3-hour call out. So, and that's primarily in larger cities like New York and Los Angeles. I don't think Chicago, for my airline, Chicago does not have a 3-hour call out. And I think for one airline, Chicago does have a 3-hour call out, but usually the 3-hour call out is for LA and New York, San Francisco. So what that means is if your company calls you at 4 p.m., then typically you will have until 6 p.m. to get to your airport to check in on time. And of course, they call you sometimes in advance, but that's the minimum time frame to be called out 2 hours in advance. How long people are on reserve depends on the airline and the base. So for example, some legacy carriers, some people that are based like in Denver, where that is a very senior base, some people are on reserve for the legacy carriers for like 20 years. Some legacy carriers don't put everybody on reserve, and everyone has to work 6 days of reserve every month, and that would be pretty much their entire career. Regional carriers like the one that I work for, depending on base, when I was on reserve initially for 4 months. These days I find that most people are on reserve for about a year to a year and a half, depending on where they're based. I have a friend / client that is with one of the low-cost carriers, and she is on reserve in Chicago, and she's been with her airline for about a year, and she's still on reserve. And I asked her, about transferring to another base, or how long does she expect to be on reserve in Chicago, and she said about a year and a half. So she is almost there. I have another friend / client who was at also a low-cost carrier at a different carrier, who was based in Chicago, and for about 7 or 8 months. And then she transferred to Orlando, and their Orlando base is a lot larger, and she was able to get off of reserve by immediately transferring to Orlando, and that was the whole point of the transfer, was to get off reserve. Now, as far as transferring bases, every airline is different. For example, my airline allows you to transfer as often as you want, as long as there is space available in that base. Some airlines only allow flight attendants to transfer twice a year. Some airlines every 6 months on a rolling period. Some airlines have specific dates when their flight attendants can transfer, like only in February and only in August. So each airline is different as far as how they allow you to transfer, and when and how you can transfer to the bases. And again, it's always predicated to if there is space available in that base. All right, so I went through how long you're on reserve, a couple of examples. Being on reserve. So let's talk about the times. So my particular airline, we have multiple shifts. So one of our reserve shifts is from 4 a.m. to 4 p.m. And then another shift is from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. So I am currently working the reserve 1 shift, which is 4 a.m. to 4 p.m., which means my company can call me at any time between 4 a.m. to 4 p.m. and give me a trip. Today is day 4 for me on a 5-day bucket, which means that I was scheduled for 5 days in a row. And this week so far, I haven't been called, which is nice because I'm at home and I get to stay at home and do some of the things that I normally do around the house. It is not that fun when you don't live in base, but I'll talk about that a little bit later. So they can call me at 4 a.m. and they can tell me they put something on my schedule, and it could be anywhere from 6. My start time can be anywhere from 6 a.m. to any time all day. Because I was originally in a 5-day bucket, which today is Thursday, I started on Monday. They could have called me on Monday and put me on a 4-day trip. They could have called me on Tuesday and put me on a 4-day trip. They could have called me yesterday and put me on a 3-day trip. So they can do anything, and it does include overnights. It's not specifically just you go to the airport, you fly, and then come back home. So it's a 2-hour call out. Like I said, some airlines allow 3-hour call out depending on the city. Now, again, I haven't been called, which is kind of a good thing for me. So they can call at any time. All right, I'm reading my notes. All right, so the pay while you're on reserve. Most airlines give you a guaranteed pay of, I'll say, an average of 70 hours. I've seen some airlines give a guaranteed pay of 65 hours, and I've even seen an airline that has a guaranteed pay of 82 hours. And this is per month, not bi-weekly. So this is per month. For me, that's a good thing because I usually average about 65 hours a month as far as working. I don't like to fly that much. Some people, that's not a good thing for them because some people like to work 100, 120 hours, 110 hours per month. I don't like to work that much. but I usually average about 60. Some months I do 55, some months I do 60, some months I do 65, but I usually try to stay around working 65 hours per month. So to be on reserve and have a guarantee of 75 hours per month, to me, that's a win-win. The other thing is that some people say that they don't like being on reserve because you don't know what to do throughout the day while you're waiting to be called. If you live in base, like what I'm doing now, I get the luxury of creating a little content while I'm sitting at home, which is fine. And if I get called, then I got to stop the video, pause it, go to work and do whatever I need to do and come back and pick this up later. So I typically do the normal things that I do around the house. I try to stay as close to the house as possible. And if I feel that I want to go somewhere or do something that's away from the house, then I just take my suitcase and take my stuff with me. So in case I get called, I can just go directly to the airport and I can change at the airport and do whatever later. But I typically try to stay as close to the house as possible. So I go to the gym, go have lunch with somebody that's home, catch up on my Netflix, create content like what I'm doing right now. So to me, that's a pro. But again, that's because I live in base. Some people that don't live in base don't have that luxury. So they end up just sitting around their crash pad. And if you don't know what a crash pad is, I do have a video on my YouTube page about crash pad and crash pad living, but you can always look that up. So just look up what is a crash pad and pros and cons of that as well. So some people don't like it because they don't want to sit around and do nothing in their crash pad if they're not living in base. The other thing is that flight attendants get paid a per diem, which means that anytime that you are away from your base, you get paid an hourly rate around the clock. So if you have not been called out, you're not getting paid the per diem. And a lot of people say that they count, on that extra money while they're flying. So some people will prefer to get called out so they can also get the per diem. Another con, I would say, is that some people don't like being on reserve because they don't know where they're going to go. You have no control on where you're going. At least when you're bidding for trips, you have some idea of where you want to go, and you can bid for that trip, and you can go on the trip and go places, go on trips on places where you want to go or visit. But when you're on reserve, you have no idea. You just, wherever they tell you, that's where you're going. You have no control over time. A lot of times when flight attendants bid, they bid to start around certain times of the day, but when you're on reserve, you don't have that control either. The other thing that I didn't point out earlier when I talked about the reserve timing, like I said, my particular airline, we have shifts. So we have a 4 a.m. to 4 p.m. Some airlines have around the clock shifts or a 24-hour shift. So they can call you starting at 12 a.m., so midnight, all the way up to 11:59 p.m. That same day. And so it's hard to navigate sometimes for people because they don't know when they should take a nap. It's your schedule tends to be off. So if you're on a 24-hour shift, and you wake up at 9 a.m. and they haven't called you, and then they still haven't called you, and you just been doing whatever throughout the day, and then at 10 p.m. they call you and tell you that you have to be at work at 4 a.m. That is possible. And so a lot of people don't like to be on reserve primarily because of that. The other thing is for regional flight attendants, if you're on reserve, flying regionally, you have multiple carriers. And so you have to be prepared with the proper scarf, I should say, or uniform for each carrier. So that is another drawback of being on reserve because you don't know how to plan. So here's a prime example. Once I was on reserve and I was living in Los Angeles, based in Chicago. And so in LA, it's 80 degrees. I come to Chicago, it's 60 degrees. So number one, I have to be prepared for that weather being in Chicago. Then two, then I get put on a trip where it was a 2-day trip where I had to go to Canada. Canada, it was 30 degrees, right? When I left LA, I had no idea that I was going to be going to Canada, being on reserve. So I worked this 2-day trip where I had to fly and stay in Canada one day. And then I came back to Chicago, back on reserve. And then I got called to go to Houston for a day where it's 80 degrees. So most people will say the drawback for being on reserve is because you don't know where you're going. And if you don't live on base, or if you don't live in base, you have to get prepared for, or try to be prepared for any type of weather situation, where you're going. If you need coats, if you need a bathing suit, you need short sleeves, long sleeves. So it's sometimes people find that it's a challenge to prepare or pack for that. And so most people that are on reserve that are not in base, they tend to end up carrying a lot of stuff in their suitcase because they don't know where they're going. Now, one of the pros for being on reserve, I would say for a legacy carrier, is that flying international is for very senior flight attendants. A lot of senior flight attendants want to fly internationally. So most junior flight attendants will have a higher probability of getting on a international trip because they're on reserve, rather than if they just bid for an international trip. If you bid for it as a junior flight attendant, you will never get it. But being on reserve, you have a greater chance of flying internationally, being on reserve. And I think that might be it. I covered how many hours some airlines pay. And I'm sorry, I'm looking away from the camera. I'm looking at my notes. What is being on reserve, some of the pros, some of the cons, and how long you're on reserve. So those are I guess that's the basic information about being on reserve. Just remember that being a flight attendant, you will always be on reserve when you first start. How long depends on your carrier and also where you are based. So I hope that was helpful. If you have any other questions about being on reserve, be sure to put it in the comment section and I will definitely respond. If you want to have some different additional information about anything about being a flight attendant, feel free to reach out to me via social media, Jewane Newman on Facebook. Also, you can join the FlyGirlSchool Facebook group. You can follow me on Instagram at FlyGirlSchool. Of course, continue to watch any other YouTube videos at FlyGirlSchool. And then you can also visit my website at flygirlschool.com or also JewaneNewman.com. So if there's anything else that you want to know, I do also provide coaching, and coaching includes prepping for your interviews, getting you ready for your video interviews, and then also preparing as you go through training and also navigating through Fly Girl life. All right, so again, this is Jewane Newman with Fly Girl School. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.